Frost hadn't touched the lower orchard yet, but the survey stakes had. Orange flags marked rows of Granny Smith trees that had stood since 1968, and Eleanor Marsh stood in her barn coat, counting them before the mining company's crew arrived to count them too. She told them no in April. They came back in October with a bigger number and a man who wouldn't look at the trees, only at his phone. That was the part that bothered her most. Not the offer, not even the surveyors. It was that nobody from Continental Ridge Mining had walked the orchard since the day they'd first knocked on her door. The orchard sat on 62 acres outside Willow Creek, a town of 1,100 people where the post office still closed for lunch. Eleanor's husband, Pete, had planted the first 11 rows the year they married, working weekends around his job at the grain elevator until the trees outnumbered the debt. By the time he died of a heart attack in the equipment shed 9 years ago, the orchard fed 60 families through the co-op and put Eleanor's name on a bank loan she'd paid down to almost nothing. She was 67 now. Her hands had the look of someone who still did her own pruning, and she did 3 hours every clear morning in February, a ladder and a pair of Felco shears, and nobody to talk to but the trees. Her son had moved to Spokane for work. Her daughter called on Sundays. The orchard was the one thing in Eleanor's life that still answered when she showed up. Continental Ridge Mining had bought the mineral rights under half the county 2 years earlier, back when a deposit of lithium-bearing clay was discovered 18 miles north. Nobody in Willow Creek understood lithium. They understood that trucks started coming through town and that a man named Russ Ferrante started showing up at the diner with a clipboard and a way of talking that made big numbers sound small. He'd offered Eleanor $340,000 for the orchard in the spring, more than double what the land would fetch as farmland. She said no. The mining company's geological survey, he explained, showed the clay seam ran directly beneath her southern acreage, and an open-pit operation would need that ground. He came back in October with $410,000 and a 30-day deadline. He also came back with a hydrology report stating that test wells drilled 200 yards from her property showed no measurable change in groundwater levels, which was the only thing standing between Continental Ridge and a permit from the county. Eleanor read that report twice at her kitchen table. Then she walked outside and looked at her irrigation pond, which had dropped 4 inches since August. She wrote that down in a spiral notebook she kept by the door, the same one she used for spray dates and frost warnings. October 14th, pond down again. Check tomorrow. She brought the notebook to the county commissioners' meeting in November, where Continental Ridge was presenting its hydrology findings ahead of a permit vote. Russ Ferrante stood at the front of the room in a clean jacket and walked the commissioners through charts showing stable water tables, citing the consulting firm Continental Ridge had hired, a firm called Basin Analytics Group, whose name was printed on every page in a tasteful blue font. When the floor opened for public comment, Eleanor stood up with her notebook and said her pond had dropped 4 inches since the test wells went in. One of the commissioners, a younger man named Avery Holt, asked if she'd had the water tested. She said no. Ferrante, polite but quick, said pond levels fluctuated naturally with rainfall and evaporation, and that Basin Analytics instruments were calibrated to a standard the county itself had approved the year before. Nobody argued with him. The room moved on to a discussion about road access for the haul trucks. Eleanor sat back down and put her notebook in her coat pocket, and a woman 2 rows behind her, whom she didn't know, reached forward and squeezed her shoulder once. The vote was tabled for 60 days, pending a follow-up inspection, which Ferrante didn't seem worried about. He told a reporter from the Willow Creek Gazette afterward that the data spoke for itself, and that he expected the project to break ground by spring. He wasn't being cruel. He was a man with a deadline of his own, a regional office in Boise that wanted the lithium project moving, and an orchard that was, to him, 62 acres standing between a deposit worth tens of millions and the company that owned the rights to it. Eleanor didn't know much about hydrology. She knew about water the way a person knows a kitchen they've cooked in for 40 years, not by the textbook, but by feel. So she started doing what she'd always done when something didn't sit right. She watched, and she wrote it down. Every morning before pruning, she walked the perimeter of the irrigation pond with a tape measure and a stake she'd driven into the bank at the water line back in September. She recorded the distance from the stake to the water's edge in the notebook, dated each entry, and noted the weather. October 21st, stake to water, 14 inches. Clear, no rain in 9 days. October 28th, stake to water, 17 inches. Same. The first thing she noticed 3 weeks in was that the drop wasn't steady. It sped up on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She didn't understand why until she remembered that Continental Ridge's test wells ran a pump cycle twice a week to draw water samples for ongoing monitoring. Information she only knew because her neighbor's nephew worked a seasonal job hauling equipment for the company and mentioned it once at the feed store, not thinking it mattered. She wrote that down too. Pump cycles Tuesday/Thursday. Ask nephew which wells. The second thing she noticed took longer. Her well, the one that fed the house, separate from the irrigation pond, had always run a little sulfurous in late fall, a smell Pete used to joke about. That November, the smell was stronger, and the water came out faintly cloudy for the first time in the 9 years she'd lived there alone. She filled a clean mason jar from the tap and labeled it with the date and set it on the windowsill, where it sat next to 4 others by December, a small cloudy lineup that nobody else had seen. The third thing came almost by accident. Eleanor's daughter sent her a county GIS map link that fall, hoping her mother could find old property lines for a fence dispute with a neighbor. While she was on the site, Eleanor noticed she could pull up historical well permits filed with the State Water Resources Department. Public record, free to view, mostly unread by anyone outside the agency. She found Continental Ridge's test well permits, filed the previous year, and noticed something in the depth listings. The wells were drilled to 340 feet. Her irrigation pond and house, well, both drew from a shallow aquifer documented in a 1974 county survey at roughly 60 to 90 feet. If the test well sat at 340 feet, they were measuring a deeper aquifer entirely, not the one her water came from. Basin Analytics' report wasn't lying about stable water levels. It was telling the truth about the wrong layer of ground. She didn't have the training to know if that mattered. So she did the only thing that made sense to a woman who'd spent 4 decades trusting trees more than talk. She called the state's Department of Water Resources and asked, plainly, whether a deep test well could show stable readings while a shallow aquifer above it dropped. The woman on the phone, a hydrogeologist named Carla Whitfield, said yes, that was not only possible, but common, especially if mining or drilling activity disturbed a confining clay layer between the 2 aquifers and let water drain downward from the shallow zone into the deep one. Eleanor asked if anyone would test that. Carla said usually only if someone requested it and paid for it, since the county's review only required the operator's own data. Eleanor asked what it would cost. $400 for a basic shallow aquifer sampling and water table reading, conducted by an independent licensed hydrologist, results filed directly with the state. She wrote a check that week. The independent hydrologist, a soft-spoken man named Dale Pruitt who drove up from Twin Falls in a truck older than Eleanor's tractor, drilled 2 shallow monitoring points on her property in early December. One near the pond, one near the house well, at a cost that ended up at $460 once mileage was added. He took readings over 11 days. Meanwhile, Continental Ridge moved forward as though the matter were settled. Ferrante told the commissioners in a follow-up letter that Basin Analytics monitoring continued to show no impact and that the company anticipated final permit approval in January. He mentioned, almost as an aside in a community meeting, that the project would bring 40 construction jobs and an estimated $2.1 million in county tax revenue over the first 5 years. People in Willow Creek, many of whom needed work, started to come around. A man Eleanor had known for 20 years told her at church that he hoped she'd reconsider, not unkindly, just tired of watching the town argue with itself. Her pond kept dropping. By mid-December, the stake she'd driven in September stood 26 inches clear of the water. The mason jars on her windowsill numbered 7, each one slightly murkier than the last, like a slow photograph developing. Dale Pruitt's preliminary numbers came back the third week of December. The shallow aquifer beneath Eleanor's property had dropped an average of 1.8 feet over the monitoring period, far beyond what seasonal evaporation could explain, and consistent with downward drainage into a deeper zone under sustained pumping. He flagged a secondary finding too: elevated turbidity and a faint trace of drilling additive in her house well sample, the kind used in test well construction. He didn't draw conclusions in his report. He wasn't there to. He just filed the data, as the law allowed him to, with the State Water Resources Office, the same office that managed permit review for projects like Continental Ridge's. Eleanor kept pruning. She didn't call the Gazette. She didn't post anything online. She wrote one more line in her notebook, dated December 19th, sent Dale's report to the state. Now we wait. The county commissioners reconvened on January 9th to vote on the Continental Ridge permit. Russ Ferrante arrived expecting a formality. He'd told his regional director the project would break ground by March, and the county tax revenue figures were already in a press release drafted and waiting. Before the vote, the State Department of Water Resources submitted a formal comment to the commission, a one-page letter signed by a senior hydrogeologist, noting that an independent monitoring report filed in December showed a statistically significant decline in the shallow aquifer underlying the affected parcels, inconsistent with the operator's deep well data, and recommending the county require a supplemental shallow aquifer study before any permit approval. Commissioner Avery Holt read the letter aloud. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when people are doing arithmetic in their heads. Ferrante asked for a recess to review the document. When the meeting resumed 40 minutes later, he said Continental Ridge would welcome the additional study, a sentence that cost him nothing to say and meant the project was, for now, dead in the water, almost literally. The supplemental study, conducted over the following 8 weeks at Continental Ridge's expense, confirmed Dale Pruitt's findings and added a detail nobody had anticipated. The confining clay layer separating the two aquifers had likely been compromised not by the test wells themselves, but by a 1991 exploratory borehole drilled by a previous mining lease that had never been properly sealed, a fact buried in a decades-old filing that the original company no longer existed to answer for. Continental Ridge's permit application was withdrawn in March. The $410,000 offer for Eleanor's orchard was never formally rescinded. It simply stopped being mentioned. The company's predicted project value, the $2.1 million in tax revenue Ferrante had cited at the community meeting, never materialized. What did materialize was a $460 invoice from Dale Pruitt, a stack of mason jars that Eleanor eventually emptied and rinsed for canning, and a notebook with 4 months of handwriting in it that nobody but her had read in full. She was at the commissioners' meeting when the withdrawal was announced. She didn't stand up. She just closed the notebook in her lap and looked, for a moment, at nothing in particular. Word moved through Willow Creek the way it always did, slowly, sideways, through the feed store and the church parking lot rather than any single announcement. People didn't talk about Eleanor Marsh defeating a mining company. They talked about the well water and the aquifer and how it turned out the deep wells and the shallow wells weren't even drinking from the same glass. Dale Pruitt got 2 more calls that spring from neighboring landowners who wanted their own water tested, just in case. The county quietly added a shallow aquifer testing requirement to its mining permit checklist, buried in an appendix nobody outside the planning office would ever read closely. Eleanor didn't give an interview to the Gazette, though they asked. She told the reporter, briefly, on her porch, that she just wanted to know what was happening to her own water before anyone decided what it was worth. Then she went back to her pruning because February was coming and the trees didn't care what had happened to the courthouse. Her pond came back up 4 inches by April, on its own, the way ponds do once nothing's pulling at them from underneath. If you're watching this from a town small enough that everybody still waves on the road, hit subscribe. We tell the kind of stories that don't always make the news. The slow ones, the patient ones, the ones where nobody raised their voice and the truth still found its way to the surface. There's more of them coming. Pete's 11 original rows of Granny Smiths still stood that spring, same as they had for 50-some years, and Eleanor walked them the way she always had. Ladder in one hand, shears in the other, no audience, no announcement. The notebook went back on its shelf by the door, next to a stack of older ones going back to 1987, all of them full of the same small, careful handwriting. Dates, weather, water levels, things most people would never think worth recording. But that was the thing about land. It didn't argue. It didn't posture or present slideshows to a room full of commissioners. It just kept its own quiet ledger, inch by inch, season by season, and waited for someone patient enough to read it. Eleanor had spent 40 years learning to listen to trees before she ever needed to listen to water, and maybe that was the only reason she noticed at all. Not because she was looking for a fight, but because she'd never stopped paying attention to a place most people had stopped looking at closely. The mining company moved on to survey ground 40 miles east by summer. Nobody in Willow Creek thought much more about it. The orchard kept its rows, the pond kept its level, and somewhere in a drawer, a stack of empty mason jars sat rinsed and ready, in case anyone ever needed to look that closely again.